If you've watched any of the coronavirus press conferences over the last few weeks, you probably noticed something. Behind most of the governors or mayors, there's usually someone signing for them, so that the deaf and the hard of hearing can know what's going on. Now I want you to contrast that with some church live streams you may have seen over the past few weeks, and think about how many are actually accessible to the deaf and the hard of hearing. There's not a lot. Okay, so churches are not that accessible to the deaf and the hard of hearing. But let's talk about why they're not accessible. And that first starts with ADA. This is ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was created by the United States government in 1990, and its basic job is to protect people with disabilities against any kind of discrimination. But there's an important line in subchapter 3. It's kind of hard to find. The provisions of this subchapter shall not apply to private clubs or establishments exempted from coverage under Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or to religious organizations or entities controlled by religious organizations, including places of worship. So let's figure this out. The government passes this act that makes all public services, health, and welfare available and accessible to those with disabilities. This includes things like elevators in buildings or ramps up to buildings. It includes all public transportation. It includes not being discriminated against during a job interview simply because you have some kind of disability. And in this case, it means that public messages, like the COVID ones, need to be accessible to the deaf and the hard of hearing. But religious organizations don't have to do any of that. And it's made the church very lazy in helping people with disabilities.
Churches, places of worship are exempt from providing these basic accessibilities.
This is Abigail Mercurio. She's an ASL interpreter at my church.
Which has had a huge impact on people that are deaf or hard of hearing to be able to be involved with places of worship and churches.
The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990 and churches are exempt from that.
This is Lucy Crabtree, and she's written for Fathom on this exact topic.
And I think that one of the unfortunate consequences of being exempt from that act is that churches never really learned how to be accessible to people with disabilities of any kind.
Now I know what you're thinking. It's good that the church doesn't have to follow ADA, because that means there's a separation between church and state. And I'm with you, but at the same time, the deaf and the hard of hearing experience has not been great at churches. And I asked someone from my church, Dana Kennedy, if she would give me her general experience of growing up in the church.
So I'm hard of hearing, and my experience with church growing up, I didn't really go to church because there really wasn't any interpreters. So it was really hard for me to understand the message and the sermon. I really struggled. So I decided to not go to church.
Lucy actually had something similar to say.
Overall, if I had to pick a word to describe general church experiences, not the only word, but one of the words would probably be discouraging.
Now, I promise you, I am not trying to shame you or your church for not having accessibility for the deaf or the hard of hearing. But there's a lot of misconceptions that the church has of the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I want to dispel a few of those misconceptions to show you how easy it can be to get started and be accessible. Misconception number 1. There's just not a lot of deaf or hard of hearing people in my area. Now it might vary for how many deaf or hard of hearing people are actually in your area, because certain areas are more accessible than others. But statistically, 466 million people around the world deal with some kind of disabling hearing loss. That's 5% of the world's population, according to the World Health Organization. And you might be sitting there saying, but none of these people come to my church. Lucy, what do you think about that?
If you don't have anyone in your congregation who's deaf or hard of hearing, either someone is lying about that, they're hiding that, just because statistically it's very likely that somebody is starting to experience even like age-related hearing loss. And if you don't have anyone in your congregation who's deaf or hard of hearing, you really might ask yourself why, why that is. Because again, statistically, up to 48 million Americans have some degree of hearing loss. So if they're not in your church, it's probably because they don't feel comfortable being there. They feel like it's not accessible.
So statistically speaking, there's probably a lot more deaf and hard of hearing people in your area than you even realize. Misconception number 2. They can just go to a church that has accessibility. Now the issue with this is that not a lot of churches are actually able to help. Estimates show that only 5% are even making an effort with the deaf and the hard of hearing community. I checked out this one website that has a map of deaf accessible churches, and let's run this exercise. Say I lived in my dream location of Yellowstone National Park. If I wanted to go to a church that was accessible to the deaf, I'd have to go to Billings, Montana. That's 4 hours and 23 minutes away. Maybe that's an extreme example, but now let's talk about my own more densely populated state of New Jersey. Where I live, if my own church was not accessible to the deaf and the hard of hearing, I'd have to drive 40 minutes away to Scotch Plains. I mean, that's not exactly convenient.
So deaf and hard of hearing people typically feel ignored, and maybe it depends on their individual needs as well. For my situation, I haven't really felt ignored, but that's really been because my church has really provided accessibility regarding interpreting and captioning, which has been extremely beneficial.
Misconception number 3. They can just read the person's lips. Just try to read my lips. Now, I'm a little atypical in that I don't move my lips a ton when I talk, but deaf people can read lips a little bit better than hearing people can. But still, that's not the ideal. Churches really need to step up their game and start providing access for the deaf and the hard of hearing. And I know a lot of you out there who might work for a church might say, we don't have the money or the resources to do this. But it just takes a little bit of time. Something as simple as providing the transcript for your sermon helps. Then the next step would be captioning during the service. And then maybe the step after that would be providing ASL interpreters. These things are not that difficult to do. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of effort to make your church just that much more accessible to the deaf and the hard of hearing.
So what churches can do better regarding accessibility is to contact the deaf community and the deaf community in their area and just find out what their needs are. How can the church better provide accessibility? Sometimes churches just don't know how or where to start.
And it's just a learning curve for everybody. It takes a while, and we're not all going to get it right away first time.
You can always ask for help. And that can really make the deaf community feel welcomed with your church.
Misconception number 4. They can just get cochlear implants or something. Now we've all seen those videos. The first time someone can hear their kid's voice or their spouse's voice, and it's really tear-inducing. But that is not the typical deaf experience. Most deaf people are very proud of being deaf. And sometimes when deaf people come to hearing churches, they're shooed to the front and people start praying for their healing. And that is the worst thing that you can do.
I think often we hold a lot of something called autism and ableism, like this view that, things are, often things are superior because if we can speak or if we're able-bodied. I think a lot of times I've heard continuously a lot of deaf people have had really negative experiences with churches because sometimes they'll go and the first thing I think hearing people do is like, okay, let me pray for you to be healed. You just need to be fixed. Because I think we're in this mindset of like, oh, you can't hear, like poor you. And I think that really, deaf people, I think a lot of times Christians have this mindset of, just deaf people need to be fixed. They just need to hear. They just need to be able to communicate how I communicate. And I think for many deaf people that has been such a negative experience. A lot of them, I had a friend who he went to church and his family made him go to the front and they stuck their fingers in his ear, and like that really turned him off.
I mean, that's enough to turn anybody off from the church. If that happened to me, I probably would never step foot in a church again. But something the hearing world has to understand is that the deaf community is a culture, and most deaf people love being deaf and they love their culture. Okay, I had to change spots because this is my last point and I want it to be a bit more dramatic. But when I was in college and grad school, all my professors used to say that the church always led the way on social justice issues. So any people that were marginalized, the church always fought for them. And the more I've been around, the less I actually believe that. In this specific area for the deaf and the hard of hearing, the government is putting the church to shame. But I really don't want to shame you or your church into getting a deaf ministry, because shame isn't going to get you that far. But I do think churches that don't provide accessibility for the deaf and the hard of hearing are missing out on a really beautiful community. For as long as my church has been accessible to the deaf and the hard of hearing, we have gained so many incredible people, and they have taught our church so many incredible things. And for churches that aren't accessible, you are missing out on a really, really beautiful community.
I think they're just missing out on the breadth and the depth of community, really, because when you leave out people who are deaf or hard of hearing or who have any other kind of disability, like you're leaving out the people that Jesus saw